She took him down in 4 seconds. The security guard outweighed her by 90 pounds, had 6 inches on her, and had his hand on her arm before she moved. One redirect, one controlled sweep, and he hit the linoleum face first with his arm twisted at an angle that made 2 passing nurses freeze mid-step. Abigail Carter straightened her scrubs, picked up the chart she'd dropped, and kept walking down the hallway like she'd simply stepped around a puddle. Nobody asked what happened. Nobody stopped her. That was the problem with being invisible. People assumed you were harmless. If this story grips you, follow along until the very end. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Pinecrest Regional Hospital sat at the edge of Fairmont, Virginia, the kind of mid-sized city that liked to call itself progressive while keeping its hierarchies exactly where they'd always been. The hospital was newer than it looked, 12 floors of glass and pale stone, a level 2 trauma center that handled everything from farm accidents to gunshot wounds that came down from the interstate. It had a good reputation, a mediocre cafeteria, and a nursing staff that was perpetually understaffed and overworked. Abigail had been there 11 weeks. She came through a contract agency, Resolute Staffing, one of the regional firms that supplied temporary nurses to hospitals when the census spiked and the permanent staff couldn't cover the floor. 11 weeks was long enough to learn the rhythms of the unit, the location of every supply closet, which elevator ran slow, and which attending physicians would throw a chart at the wall when they were having a bad afternoon. It was not long enough to be considered part of anything. She was 31 years old, 5'6", lean in a way that looked like poor diet rather than conditioning. Her hair was the kind of pale blonde that washed out under fluorescent lighting, which meant she had a talent for disappearing into the background even when she was standing right in front of you. Colleagues forgot her name. Attendings talked over her. The charge nurse on 4 North, a woman named Darlene Voss, who had been at Pinecrest for 19 years and treated that tenure like a military rank, had referred to Abigail twice this week as the temp, despite having been corrected both times. Abigail had not pressed the issue. She never did. She'd learned a long time ago that the people most eager to correct the record were the ones who needed other people to know who they were. She didn't need that. She already knew exactly who she was, and the knowledge was not something she carried lightly. The morning she put the security guard on the floor started like every other shift. She clocked in at 6:50, changed in the staff locker room, and reviewed the overnight handoff notes while drinking coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since the previous Tuesday. The 4 North unit handled general medical surgical cases, mostly post-op patients, a few cardiac step-downs, the occasional overflow from the ICU when beds ran short. It was not glamorous work. It required patience, precision, and the ability to stay focused across a 12-hour shift that rarely went the way it was planned. By 8:15, she had completed her initial assessments on 7 of her 9 assigned patients, restarted an IV that had infiltrated overnight, called pharmacy about a dosing discrepancy on a patient's blood thinner, and flagged a new onset fever to the attending before the attending had even made it through morning rounds. The attending, a hospitalist named Dr. Marcus Webb, mid-40s, the kind of doctor who wore expensive watches and spoke to nurses with the particular brand of condescension that had probably been baked into him in medical school, glanced at the flag and said, "I'll look at it when I get there," without looking up from his tablet. She noted the time and moved on. The situation with the security guard developed around 9. Room 412 had been a source of tension since the previous night. The patient had been admitted through the ER around 2 in the morning. A John Doe, no ID, no next of kin, brought in by ambulance after being found unconscious in a parking structure off Meridian Avenue. The ER had stabilized him, noted significant scarring consistent with shrapnel wounds across his torso and left arm, and transferred him upstairs when his vitals evened out. He was listed as a psych hold candidate pending evaluation because when he'd regained partial consciousness in the ER, he had apparently become combative enough that 2 nurses and an ER tech had needed to clear the room. The night shift had written him up as a danger to staff. Darlene had flagged the room with a yellow alert, meaning no solo entry, no engagement without security presence. By morning, the unofficial word on the floor was that he was either a violent drug user or someone who'd had a psychiatric break, and the collective staff preference was to keep the door closed, maintain sedation as ordered, and wait for the psych team to handle it. Abigail had read the chart at handoff. Something about it bothered her. The vitals didn't match the narrative. His BP was elevated but controlled. His oxygen saturation was strong. The lab work showed no drug screen positives, no alcohol in his system. The only notation about his behavior was a single line from the ER nurse. Patient became agitated when staff attempted to remove his personal effects, restrained after 2 failed de-escalation attempts. She'd asked what personal effects. The handoff nurse had shrugged. Nothing. He didn't have anything on him when he came in. Which meant he'd been agitated not because of what staff was taking, but because of something else entirely. She went to check on him at 9:05. The door was closed. Through the small window she could see him lying still, wrists in soft restraints, eyes closed, but the kind of closed that wasn't sleep. Too controlled, too deliberate. The monitoring lines were attached. His breathing was regular. She pushed the door open. The change was immediate. His eyes opened, and the thing that struck her first was not the size of him. He was broad through the shoulders, probably 6'1", even prone, with the kind of physical stillness that came from actual training rather than medication. But the quality of his attention. He was completely oriented. Whatever they'd given him to keep him calm, it wasn't touching him the way it would touch a normal patient. He was tracking the door, tracking her position, tracking the hallway behind her in a single sweep that took less than a second. She recognized that sweep. She'd learned it herself years ago under very different circumstances. "Morning," she said, and stepped inside, letting the door fall shut behind her. "I'm Abigail. I'm one of the nurses on this floor." He didn't answer. His eyes moved to her hands. "I'm not carrying anything," she said. "I'm not here to adjust your meds or restrain you further. I just want to check your vitals and see how you're doing." A long pause. "You walked in alone?" "I did." "They've been sending 2 people and a guard." "I know." She crossed to the monitor and reviewed the overnight numbers without making any sudden movements. "The guard is probably outside, actually, but he didn't follow me in." Another pause. "Why not?" She glanced over her shoulder at him. His face was in rough shape. There was bruising along his jaw, a healing laceration above his left eyebrow that had been closed with steri strips in the ER, and the shadow of old damage that spoke to a life that had not been gentle. But his eyes were clear, sharp, the kind of sharp that didn't come from nowhere. "Because I didn't give him time to notice I was coming in," she said. "I wanted to talk to you before someone came in and made noise about the protocol." His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Barely. Just a fractional release of tension in his upper body that she caught only because she was looking for it. "What protocol?" he said. "The one that says you're a danger and nobody should engage with you alone." She set the chart down and pulled the rolling stool to the bedside. "Can I check your arm? I want to look at the IV site. The overnight note says you refused when they tried. They came in at 3 a.m. with 4 people." "Yeah," she said. "That would make me difficult too." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his arm over, exposing the IV site. She checked it. Still patent, no infiltration, site clean. She made a note. "Can you tell me your name?" Silence. "All right. You don't have to." She replaced the tape and sat back. "You know what I noticed when I read your chart this morning? No toxicology findings, no signs of a psychiatric history. And the reason they flagged you in the ER as combative is because you reacted when staff came at you in a team." He was watching her. "That's not psych," she said. "That's training." The silence stretched for another few seconds. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about." She held his gaze. "Where were you hit? Because the scarring on your left side looked like fragmentation to me, and the way you cleared the doorway when I came in, that's not something you pick up on the street." His jaw tightened. "What are you, a doctor?" "Nurse," she said. "Before that, 68W. Army combat medic, Fort Carson, 2 deployments." Something shifted in his face then. A small thing, a slight cracking of the wall, and he let out a breath through his nose like he'd been holding it for several hours. "Which unit?" he said. "3rd Brigade, 4th Infantry. You?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes went to the ceiling, then back to her. "Who else on this floor knows that?" Nobody, she said. I don't talk about it. The door opened before he could respond. Darlene Voss came in first, clipboard in hand, with a security guard, a large man named Officer Garrett, who Abigail had seen at the nurse's station earlier. Right behind her, a third person followed. Dr. Rachel Cho, the psychiatric resident who had been assigned to do the evaluation. Carter, Darlene's voice had the particular edge she used when she wanted to make a point in front of an audience. Why are you in here alone? I flagged this room yellow. That means no solo entry. I was doing a vitals check, Abigail said, standing. He's cooperative. That is not your call to make. Darlene stepped fully into the room, not looking at the patient, addressing Abigail in the tone of someone who had decided the audience needed a lesson. You are a contracted temp. You follow floor protocols. You don't make independent decisions about patient access levels. Do you understand that? Behind Darlene, the patient's eyes had gone flat and still again, watching Garrett, tracking Cho, reassessing the situation. I understand, Abigail said. Good. Please leave the room. Dr. Cho needs to conduct her evaluation. Abigail moved toward the door. She passed within 3 feet of the patient and allowed herself one glance, brief, direct, and he met it. Something passed between them that had no name in a hospital setting. She stepped out into the hallway and let the door fall shut. Through the window, she watched Garrett move to the bedside without announcing himself, reaching for the patient's arm to check the restraint, a movement that would register as a grab to someone trained to respond to grabs. And she was already moving her hand toward the door handle when it happened. The patient's elbow came up, Garrett went sideways, and in the half second before everything escalated, she shoved the door open and said, loudly and clearly, Garrett, stop. Step back. The authority in her voice was not a nursing thing. Garrett froze. Darlene said, What in the... And Cho pressed herself against the wall, and the patient, who had gotten Garrett's wrist into a lock that could have broken 3 things in the next second, slowly released it and settled back against the mattress with the controlled deliberateness of someone who had made a tactical decision to stand down. He's startled, Abigail said, stepping into the room. If you come at him from the right without announcing yourself, he reacts. That's not a psychiatric issue. It's a startle response from trauma. He's not a danger if you don't approach him like a threat. Darlene stared at her. You just told a security officer to stand down. I told him to step back. There's a difference. She looked at Garrett, who was rubbing his wrist and looking at the patient with an expression that was half anger and half something else. Something that looked, if she read it correctly, like the beginning of respect. Are you okay? Fine, Garrett said, which was obviously not entirely true, but he stepped back. Darlene said, Carter, hallway, now. What followed was predictable. Darlene delivered a formal verbal warning in the corridor outside the nurse's station, loud enough for 2 other staff members to hear, about protocol violations, insubordination, and the specific clause in the Resolute staffing contract that gave Pinecrest supervisory authority over temp staff. Abigail listened. She did not argue. She did not apologize either, which seemed to frustrate Darlene more than the original incident. I'll be contacting your agency this afternoon, Darlene said. All right. I want you off this room assignment. You'll be reassigned to 4 South for the remainder of the shift. Okay. Darlene seemed almost annoyed that she had nothing to push against. Do you have anything to say? Abigail thought about it for a moment. The patient in 412 is not a psych case. I think it would be worth pulling his injury records from the ER and looking at the scarring pattern before the psych team forms conclusions. Darlene blinked. That is not your concern. No, Abigail agreed. It's not. She went to 4 South. The morning continued. She picked up 4 new patients, managed an escalating pain situation with a post-op hip replacement, helped a younger nurse navigate a family conflict over end-of-life orders, and ate half a granola bar at 11:30 because there was no time for an actual break. The regular rhythms of the work settled over her like a second skin, familiar and numbing in the way that all hospital work eventually became, the constant low hum of something urgent just on the edge of breaking. She didn't go back to 412. She thought about the man in that room, though, the way he'd swept the doorway, the way he'd tracked 4 people simultaneously without appearing to move. She thought about what her chart read had told her, and what her eyes had confirmed, And she turned it over in the back of her mind the way she used to turn over tactical problems when she had time to think on deployment. Something was wrong, not with the patient, with the situation around him. It was a feeling she'd learned to trust, not instinct. She was skeptical of people who called things instinct, as if the body were running on magic rather than pattern recognition. But accumulated observation, the kind that built up over years of reading environments where the cost of misreading was not an incident report, but a body bag. At 12:40, she passed the nursing station and overheard two staff members talking in the way people talk when they assume the background is empty. A tech named Romy and one of the regular nurses, David Park, were standing by the medroom door. "Just weird," Park was saying. "Somebody on the medical team put in an updated order this morning. Higher dose on the sedation drip." "Authorized?" "That's the thing. I looked for the cosign and it's from Dr. Harmon. Except Harmon isn't on this case. He's not even on 4 North. Maybe a covering signature." "Maybe." Park didn't sound convinced. "But the dosage is, I don't know, it's aggressive. For someone who's not intubated, I flagged it to Webb, but he just said process it." Rami said something Abigail didn't catch because she was already moving, walking past the station toward the break room with her face neutral and her mind doing something very different from neutral. Dr. Harmon. She ran the name quickly through what she knew. 4th floor was a small enough world that names circulated. Harmon was a name she'd heard, but not from 4 North or 4 South. She'd heard it from another contracted nurse 2 weeks ago, at the end of a shift, in a conversation she hadn't been part of but had overheard the tail end of. That's Harmon's patient now, which is weird because Harmon doesn't take patients like that. She pulled up the hospital directory on her phone. Dr. Lyle Harmon, listed as an internal medicine attending. Photo showed a heavy-set man in his 50s with the kind of unremarkable face that you didn't look at twice. But below his name, his specialty listing, administrative medicine, consulting. Not clinical. Not the kind of doctor who put in orders for sedation drips on individual patients. An updated medication order, higher sedation dosage, signed by a doctor with no clinical role in the case. She stood in the break room for exactly 45 seconds. Then she went back to 412. Darlene wasn't at the station. Park had moved to a different part of the floor. She scanned the hallway, identified the window. Patient appeared awake, watching the ceiling, and made a decision. She went in. He turned his head when the door opened, and this time the wall was further down. He'd had a few hours to adjust. Or maybe he'd made a decision of his own. "It's you," he said. "It's me." She moved to the window side of the room, positioning herself where she could see the hallway through the door window. "I need to ask you something quickly, and I need you to be direct with me. I'm not telling you my name." "That's not what I'm asking." She kept her voice low. "Does anyone know you're here outside the hospital?" A pause. "Define anyone. Someone you trust. Someone who'd be looking for you." His jaw worked. "No." "Is there someone who would not want you to be found?" The look he gave her answered that before he spoke. "Yeah," he said. "You could say that." "There's a medication order on your chart," she said. "Sedation increase. It was signed by a doctor who has no business touching your case. He's administrative, not clinical. The dosage, for someone at your weight and vitals, would be—" She paused, because she needed to say this carefully, and she needed him to hear it clearly. It would be significantly dangerous. He didn't react the way she expected. He didn't look surprised. He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, there was something in his expression that looked less like fear and more like exhaustion, the kind that came from already knowing something was coming and not having been wrong. "How long?" he said. "Before they process the order?" "I don't know. Could be next med pass. 2 hours, maybe less." She looked at the door. "I need to know if I'm right about what I think I'm looking at here, because if I'm wrong, I'm going to lose my job over nothing. And if I'm right, then what's happening in this room is not a medical situation." He was quiet for a long moment. The monitors beeped softly. Somewhere down the hall, a call light went off, and a door opened and footsteps came and went. "My name is Ethan," he said finally. "Ethan Cole." "Abigail Carter. I heard what she said to you in the hallway, the supervisor." He met her eyes. "You could have walked." Stayed in 4 South, stayed out of it. I know. So why are you here? She thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to be honest with herself even when the answer wasn't flattering. She was here because she'd read a chart and seen something that didn't add up. She was here because she'd looked at a man who moved like a soldier and recognized something that nobody else on this floor had bothered to look for. She was here because 11 weeks of being background furniture had not actually changed the fundamental facts of who she was. And who she was had never learned to walk away from a situation that had the shape of wrong. Because someone put a kill order on your chart, she said, and I don't think they expected anyone to notice. Ethan Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face changed, not softening exactly, more like a final internal calculation completing. They won't just come for me, he said quietly. When they find out the order didn't work, they'll know someone interfered. They'll want to know who. He paused. You understand what that means. She understood exactly what it meant. She'd been in situations where the knowing of a thing put a target on you as surely as any weapon. She knew what it felt like to look down a road and see clearly where it went. Tell me about the evidence, she said, and that was when the door opened. It wasn't Darlene, it wasn't Park or Garrett or Dr. Cho. It was someone she'd never seen before. A man in green scrubs that fit badly across the shoulders, carrying a medication tray, moving with the kind of practiced casualness that was designed to look routine and didn't quite land. He got 3 steps into the room before he saw that she was standing by the bed. He stopped. She looked at the tray. The syringe was already drawn. His eyes went to Ethan, then back to her. The calculation she saw run across his face lasted about half a second. Then he dropped the tray. The tray hit the floor and the sound of it, metal on linoleum, the bright clatter of small instruments scattering, lasted about a quarter of a second before Abigail moved. She wasn't thinking. That was the thing about training that people who'd never had it didn't understand. The point wasn't to think faster. It was to shrink the gap between perception and action until thinking wasn't the bottleneck anymore. She crossed the distance between the bedside and the door in 3 steps, got her hand on the man's arm before he'd fully turned, and used his own momentum as he pivoted to walk him directly into the wall beside the doorframe. Not hard enough to injure, hard enough to end the question of whether he was going to run. He was bigger than her. It didn't matter. Leverage wasn't about size. Who sent you? She said. Not a question, just words placed in the air between them while she held his wrist at an angle that made resisting it a bad idea. He said nothing. His eyes cut toward the door. Don't, she said. The hallway's visible from the nurse's station. If you run, you get seen. If you get seen, you've got a lot of explaining to do about that syringe. She glanced at it on the floor. Still capped, she registered, which was interesting. He'd drawn it, but hadn't uncapped it yet, which meant he'd intended to do it in the room rather than in transit, which meant he'd expected to be alone with the patient. He hadn't expected her. She eased back just enough to let him breathe, but not enough to give him options. I'm going to ask you one more time. I don't know anything, he said, and it came out clipped and flat, the voice of someone who'd been trained to give nothing. Behind her, the restraints on the bed shifted. Ethan's voice came out rough. Abigail. She glanced back. He was watching them with the focused, economical attention of someone calculating next steps, and his eyes weren't on the man she was holding, they were on the door. She understood before she looked. The door window showed the hallway beyond, and in the hallway, just passing the nurse's station with his head down and a tablet under his arm, was a man in a white coat she'd never seen on this floor. He walked like he belonged there. He didn't belong there. There's another one, Ethan said. She made a fast decision. She let go of the first man's arm, stepped back, and said quietly, Get out. Take the tray. She watched his face, which showed confusion. He'd been ready for a fight, not a release. I said get out, right now before the other one sees you are here. It was a calculated gamble. If he left, she lost the immediate physical problem and gained ambiguity. No one would know exactly what had happened in this room in the next 60 seconds. If she held him, she had a visible confrontation and no good explanation for what any of them were doing. He grabbed the tray off the floor, scooped the syringe, and was out the door in 4 seconds, moving quickly but not running, careful enough to keep from drawing attention. She locked the door. The handle locks from inside were basic, designed to give patients privacy, not security, but it bought time. She crossed to Ethan. Can you walk? Define walk. Upright and forward. Yeah. The restraints. She unclipped the soft cuffs from the bed rail. They were Velcro and buckle, not locked, and came off in seconds. Your clothes are in the closet. I saw it on the intake notes. They bagged what you were wearing. She moved to the small closet beside the bathroom and found the clear plastic patient belongings bag on the shelf. She handed it to him and went to the window. 4th floor. Parking structure visible to the east. No fire escape on this side. Stairs or elevator, she said. Stairs. He was already pulling his shirt on, moving with the careful efficiency of someone managing pain. His left side was slower than his right, the shrapnel scarring she'd noticed. Service stairwell is better. East end of the floor. You know this hospital? No, but I know how hospitals are laid out. He got his pants on, shoved his feet into shoes without tying them. The guy in the white coat. Where's he going? She checked the door window. The man had stopped at the nurse's station. She watched him say something to the nurse behind the desk, Park, who looked up and pointed down the hall, toward 412. He just got directions, she said. We have maybe a minute. Ethan looked at her steadily. His face was bruised and he was moving like his ribs hurt, and he had the particular stillness of someone who operated on a threshold for pain that was much higher than average. You're doing something here you can't take back, he said. I know. I'm not telling you to stop. I'm making sure you know. I know, she said again. Let's go. She opened the door and they went left. The hallway was not empty. It was never empty on a hospital floor. But the particular configuration of who was where bought them 30 seconds of unobserved movement. A tech was going into a room 2 doors down. The nurse's station was partially obstructed by a supply cart someone had left in the middle of the corridor. She walked with purpose, not speed. Speed drew the eye. Purpose just looked like someone on their way to something. And Ethan matched her pace without instruction, which confirmed again everything she'd already concluded about him. The service stairwell was at the end of the east corridor, behind a door marked Authorized Staff. She pushed through and let it close behind them. The stairwell was concrete and fluorescent, and smelled of cleaning products and old coffee. No cameras visible in the corners. An oversight that wouldn't last at a better-funded hospital, but Pinecrest's security infrastructure was 3 years behind its billing. Down or out, she said. Down is ground floor is visible. We need a vehicle. I don't have my car here. I took the bus. He paused on the landing, one hand on the railing, and she watched him recalibrate. Okay, ground floor, east exit, loading dock. There'll be a vehicle. You're going to steal a hospital vehicle. I'm going to borrow one. He looked at her. Unless you have a better plan. She didn't. Loading dock. They went down. 3 flights, which Ethan handled without complaint, though she could see the cost of it in the set of his jaw. When they hit the basement level, he moved with more familiarity. He'd done this kind of thing before, moving through an unfamiliar building on instinct and structural logic, and she had too, which meant they didn't have to explain to each other when to slow or when to go. The loading dock was a wide concrete bay with 2 receiving doors, a staff entrance to the left, and a row of hospital fleet vehicles, mostly vans used for patient transport, parked along the far wall. A single dock worker was running a hand truck into the left door back to them. Ethan went to the nearest transport van. The driver's window was cracked open 2 inches, which meant the interior lock was accessible with the right tool. He pulled a folded card from his shoe, a hotel key card from God knows what hotel, and had the door open in 9 seconds. You keep a card in your shoe, she said. Habit. He was already working the ignition. She got in the passenger side and looked back toward the hospital entry door. Nobody had come through it. Not yet. The van started on the second try and they pulled out of the loading bay without anyone looking up. She let out a breath she hadn't fully registered holding and directed her attention to her phone, already running through what she needed to do and how fast. She had 17 minutes before she was due back on the floor, before someone noticed she was gone, before someone checked room 412 and found empty restraints and an unmade bed. She had less than that before the man in the white coat told someone she'd been in the room. Talk to me, she said. Not about your name, not about your unit. Tell me what's in the evidence and why they want you dead right now. Ethan was driving south on the service road along the hospital's perimeter, staying under the speed that would draw a patrol car. His hands on the wheel were steady. What do you know about Operation Sandline? Nothing. Good. That's the correct answer, because officially it doesn't exist. He checked the mirrors. 18 months ago, 4 operators from a Special Forces unit were killed in an ambush in a classified location. The official report said it was a contact with hostile forces that went wrong due to bad intelligence. But it wasn't. It wasn't bad intelligence. It was precise intelligence, given to the wrong people. He paused. The kind of pause that wasn't dramatic, just someone organizing something that was still difficult to say out loud. Someone fed the location of that patrol to the people waiting for them. That's not a bad day. That's a targeted killing of American soldiers. Abigail kept her eyes on the road ahead. She said nothing because there was nothing useful to say yet. I was the 5th operator. I wasn't on the patrol. I'd been pulled 24 hours earlier for a separate tasking, which was not a coincidence. Someone made sure I wasn't there. But I saw the pre-mission documentation. I know what the patrol was carrying, what they were retrieving, and who authorized the operation. He took a left turn onto a secondary road, moving away from the hospital neighborhood. They were recovering financial records, proof that a defense contractor called Hargrove Strategic Group had been paid for military services that were never rendered, ghost contracts, millions of dollars, over 6 years, and the authorization signatures on those contracts traced back to people inside the DoD with enough rank to make the whole thing disappear. So they made the patrol disappear instead. My whole unit was stood down after. Separate investigations, no contact, everyone isolated. 2 of the other survivors left the Army inside 6 months. One died in a car accident that wasn't investigated as anything other than an accident. He glanced at her. I've been running for 4 months. I had the documents digitally. I was trying to get them to someone who couldn't be bought. What happened to the originals? I handed them off 3 weeks ago. The person I handed them to is either in federal protection or dead. I don't know which. His jaw tightened. I got hit by a car 2 days before I ended up in your hospital. I think it was intentional. She thought about the bruising. The shrapnel scars she'd already known were old. The newer damage, the jaw, the ribs, the laceration, consistent with a vehicle impact. Hargrove Strategic Group, she said. Who runs it? Publicly, a board, but operationally, a man named Victor Laswell. He said the name without inflection, which was its own kind of emphasis. He's been a defense industry figure for 20 years. He has congressional relationships, DoD relationships, a foundation that donates to veterans' causes. A short pause. He's the kind of man nobody looks at twice. She looked at him. Lyle Harmon, the doctor who signed your medication order, is he connected to Laswell? Ethan didn't answer for a moment. They were 3 miles from the hospital now, in a commercial district, the van neither conspicuous nor invisible among the other vehicles. I don't know that name, he said, but it wouldn't surprise me. They have people in a lot of places. A doctor with an administrative title who signed a lethal sedation order on a John Doe patient with no clinical reason to be on the case. She was thinking out loud, not decorating. That's not improvised. That's a structure. Someone who knew you were there, knew you'd be logged as a John Doe, had access to a hospital system and a willing physician. They've had 4 months, Ethan said. They knew I'd surface eventually. She checked her phone. A message from Darlene time-stamped 4 minutes ago. Where are you? Report to the station immediately. And then, 30 seconds after that, one from a number she didn't recognize. They know the room is empty. Get out of the vehicle. She stared at the second message for a full second. Then she said, Ethan, stop the van. He pulled over immediately, which told her everything about his reflexes. What? She showed him the screen. He read it, and his expression went from guarded to something colder and more specific. Someone's watching, he said. Someone who knows we're in a vehicle. She scanned the block, Ishwas. 2 restaurants, a hardware store, a parking structure across the street. We've been made. Or someone inside the hospital sent that warning. Those are opposite problems. I know. She thought fast. If it's a warning, we need to ditch the van because they're tracking the vehicle. If it's a threat, we need to ditch the van because they're about to box us in. Either way, we ditched the van. Either way, she agreed. They left the van on the street and went into the parking structure on foot. It was a public structure, 3 levels, open on 2 sides, and they moved through it without speaking, Ethan keeping to her left slightly behind, cover position, she registered, until they reached the far stairwell. She tried to think about who had sent the message. An unknown number. Someone with her phone number, which was in the Resolute staffing system, which Pinecrest had access to. Not a narrow field, but the message had been a warning, not a threat. The phrasing was specific, the information actionable. Whoever sent it had wanted them to move, not to freeze. She filed it and kept going. They came out on the street level 2 blocks over and she found a coffee shop, the kind that was always busy enough to be anonymous. And they went in and took a table at the back with sightlines to the door. Ethan sat down with the careful movements of someone whose ribs were reminding him they existed. He didn't complain about it. She noticed and didn't comment because she understood that some pain you just carried and mentioning it was beside the point. You said you were pushed out of the army, he said. It was the first time he'd turned the subject toward her, and it came out matter of fact, not prying. Yes. Why? She wrapped her hands around a coffee she'd ordered without tasting and considered how much truth was useful right now. The complete answer was complicated, and some of it still felt like something that lived in her chest rather than her mouth. She gave him the functional version. I filed an internal complaint about a supply requisition that didn't add up. Medical supplies that were being logged as deployed to a forward unit but weren't showing up in our inventory manifests. Someone was skimming, pharmaceuticals mostly, and routing them somewhere. I flagged it through the right channels. And I was discharged 6 months later on a conduct review. Findings were vague. Insufficient adherence to chain of command, failure to maintain appropriate professional boundaries. She took a drink of the coffee. It was too hot. I appealed. The appeal went nowhere. I got out, went through a nursing program, and spent 2 years at a hospital in Roanoke before I ended up temp. Who was skimming? I never found out. I thought I was close, and then the complaint got buried, and so did I. She looked at him across the table. I don't know if it connects to what you're describing. It might just be a separate piece of ordinary corruption. Ethan was quiet, turning something over. What unit were you supporting when this happened? She told him. His expression didn't change, but she saw his jaw tighten. That unit, he said carefully, was the same base unit that 4 of my operators were attached to before they were reassigned for Sandline. The coffee shop around them continued its ordinary noise, the hiss of an espresso machine, 2 people at the counter arguing pleasantly about something small, the door opening and letting in street noise and closing again. None of it touched the silence that opened up at their table. That's not a coincidence, she said. No, he said. It's a pattern. She had spent 2 years telling herself that what had happened to her in the army was specific and personal and bounded, that it was about her, her complaint, her career. She had made a kind of peace with that version because it was self-contained and it didn't require her to think about what else might be attached to it. Sitting in a coffee shop 3 miles from a hospital where someone had just tried to kill the man across from her, she felt that version dissolve completely. They pushed me out because I got close to something, she said. Not because I filed a complaint, because I found the edge of something bigger. Yeah. And whatever I found the edge of is the same thing you've been carrying. Yeah, he said again. She put the cup down. She looked at the door. 2 people had come in since they'd sat down. A couple, clearly together, not interested in anything except each other and the menu board. The street outside was ordinary midday Fairmont. We need the documents, she said, the ones you handed off. I told you I don't know if that person is still. If they're in federal protection, there's a way to reach them through the right channels. If they're dead, the documents went somewhere. People don't hold on to things like that without a contingency. What was their name? He looked at her for a long moment. Why do you need the name? Because I have contacts I haven't used in 2 years that I'm about to use right now, she said. And if I'm going to make those calls, I need to know what I'm asking people to look for. Another pause. Ethan Cole was a careful man. She understood it. He'd survived 4 months by being careful. And she didn't push, just waited. Margaret Osai, he said. She was a journalist, investigative. She had congressional contacts and a record of breaking things that people didn't want broken. Was. Is, I hope. He didn't look certain. I lost contact 3 weeks ago. Abigail pulled out her phone and opened a search, scanning fast. Margaret Osai, investigative journalist, a byline at a publication called the Fairmont Ledger, regional outlet, decent reputation. Last published article dated 16 days ago. Nothing after that. She searched the name against current news. A brief item, buried from 12 days ago. Ledger journalist on medical leave, editor confirms, no details. Medical leave, she said, and turned the screen so Ethan could see. He looked at it. His face went somewhere complicated. They got to her. Or she's still moving and she used the cover. Abigail pulled the screen back. Medical leave is ambiguous. It doesn't say dead. It doesn't say arrested. It says out of circulation by choice or by force, and we don't know which. How do we find out? She thought about her contact list, names she'd filed away and hadn't touched. People from Fort Carson and before. People from the Roanoke Hospital's ER rotations. One specific number she'd never deleted, even though she'd considered it several times. She scrolled until she found it. Marcus Webb was not the person she was calling. Not him, not Darlene Voss, not anyone from Pinecrest. She was looking for a name she'd hoped she'd never need. Daniel Farrow, formerly CID, Army Criminal Investigation Division, now working a vague federal contractor role that she'd always suspected was not entirely what it claimed to be. She'd met him at Fort Carson 8 years ago. He'd remembered her name when she'd run into him at a veterans conference 2 years ago, which meant she'd made enough of an impression to land in whatever mental filing system he maintained. It was a thin thread. She had thinner ones. She typed a text message. It's a C from Carson. I need to know if you can talk. Now would be better than later. She sent it and looked up. Ethan was watching the door. We've been here 15 minutes, he said. I know. We should move again. Give it 2 minutes. She held the phone and watched the screen. The reply came in 40 seconds. Saw your name come up this morning. I was going to call you. Don't use this number again. Use the one attached. She stared at the message. Her name had come up this morning. She had been at Pinecrest Regional since 6:50 a.m., invisible by design, a contracted nurse in a hospital where nobody knew her actual history. She had walked into a patient's room, assessed a situation, and removed a man from a facility where someone had tried to kill him. And her name had come up somewhere on Daniel Farrow's radar this morning. She showed Ethan. He read it, and the quiet that followed was a different quality than the one before. Not uncertain, not calculating, but the kind of still that preceded a definitive shift in understanding. They know who you are, he said. They know who I was, she said. Somebody connected my name to my history this morning, which means they ran me when they realized I'd interfered. She saved the new number and deleted the thread. Which means they know I'm not just a temp nurse. Ethan looked at her steadily. And now you're in it the same way I am. She had known that since the moment she'd unclipped his restraints. Saying it out loud didn't change anything. The number he sent, she said. It's a different line. Clean, probably. He wants to talk, which means he has something to say. She dialed. It rang twice. A voice she recognized, older than she remembered, but the particular flat Midwestern vowels were unchanged. Carter. Farrow. Where are you right now? Fairmont. Moving. Are you with him? She paused. With who? Don't do that. It wastes time and I don't have much of it. A sound on his end that might have been a door closing. Cole. Ethan J., formerly 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment. The name on the flagged hospital admission that went into a federal database at 7:14 this morning when someone ran a John Doe intake through the Pinecrest system. She looked at Ethan. He'd heard his name. The phone wasn't on speaker, but they were close enough. His face showed nothing. Yes, she said. I'm with him. Okay. A short breath. I need you to understand something before I say anything else. The flag on his name didn't come from the FBI or DOD or anyone you'd expect. It came from a private security contractor that has access to federal law enforcement databases it should not have access to. And the reason I know that is because it's been on my desk for 6 months as part of something I can't talk about on this line. Hargrove Strategic Group, she said. A silence that lasted exactly long enough to be confirming. Carter. How do you know that name? Same way I know most things, she said. I paid attention when everyone assumed I wasn't. Another pause. When Farrow spoke again, the tone had shifted. Not warmer exactly, but with a quality of recalibration she recognized, the sound of someone updating their assessment. You and Cole need to get to somewhere controlled, not a hotel, not a residential address, not anywhere that runs a transaction through a card or a system. There's a location. I'm going to text it to this line. It's a field office annex, technically offline, used for cold case storage. A colleague of mine has access. Who's the colleague? Someone who's been building a case on Hargrove for 8 months and has been waiting for a witness who survived long enough to matter. He paused. Cole is the only one left who was in the room before Sandline. You understand what that makes him. The last surviving witness, she said. Yes. And what does it make me? Farrow didn't answer immediately. She could hear him thinking, or maybe deciding how much to say. It makes you the person who kept him alive when the hospital failed, he said. And depending on what you know about your own discharge, it might make you something else. She felt something tighten in her chest. Say it plainly. Well, the supply chain irregularities you reported in, he named the year. They connected to a logistics subcontract held by a company called Dentech Solutions. Dentech Solutions was a shell entity. It dissolved 8 months after your discharge. Its parent company, 3 holding structures up, was Hargrove Strategic Group. She held the phone and breathed. There it was. The thing she'd gotten close to without knowing what she was close to. The edge of it, just as she'd said. The edge of something so much larger than a supply manifest that the distance between what she'd found and what it actually was made her briefly dizzy. 2 years. 2 years of temp work and quiet, and a life she'd built narrow and controlled, and the reason she'd lost everything she'd worked for, the reason her complaint had disappeared and her career had followed it, was sitting on the other end of a phone line in a 6-month federal investigation. Text me the address, she said. Her voice came out steady, which cost her something. 20 minutes, Farrow said. And Carter, whoever's looking for Cole is looking for you now. Act accordingly. He ended the call. She lowered the phone and looked at Ethan Cole across the table. He had heard enough. His face was a study in something she couldn't fully name. Not quite guilt, not quite recognition, closer to the expression of someone who understood that the weight they'd been carrying had, without their knowledge, been shared with someone who hadn't signed up for it. The same people, he said. The same people. I'm sorry, he said, and it came out rough and without decoration, which made it real. Don't be sorry, she said. Be useful. She stood, pocketed the phone, and looked at the door. We're meeting someone, and we need to move before someone figures out which direction we walked. She was halfway to the door when her phone buzzed. Not the text from Farrow. That came 30 seconds later. This was a different alert. A news push notification from the Fairmont Ledger's app, which she'd downloaded once and never removed. The headline read, Ledger journalist Margaret Osei found unresponsive, hospitalized. She read it once, twice, while Ethan came to stand beside her. Osei, 38, was discovered this morning in her apartment by a neighbor. Cause of illness is under investigation. Hospital officials have declined to comment. Sources close to the Ledger indicate Osei had been working on an unspecified investigative project prior to her hospitalization. She showed him. He read it. His face did something complicated and then went still. Unresponsive, he said. Hospitalized, not dead, she said, because she needed that distinction to be in the air. If she was carrying the documents, if she was carrying them digitally, they'll access her devices while she's unconscious. If she hid physical copies, he stopped. His hand moved to his jacket pocket automatically, a reflex, and then he stopped and looked at her with an expression she couldn't initially read. What? She said. He reached into his shoe again, the same shoe where the hotel keycard had lived, and came out with a folded piece of paper, soft with handling, the kind of soft that meant it had been in that shoe for a long time. He unfolded it on the coffee shop table, and she looked at it. It was a handwritten list. 12 lines, account numbers, dates, a set of initials, and two names she didn't recognize and one she did, Hargrove Strategic Group, followed by a string of numbers and a date 18 months ago. "You kept a physical copy," she said. "I kept a backup of a backup," he said. "She has the files. I have the index. Neither one is complete without the other." He refolded it carefully, and this time he didn't put it in his shoe. He held it. "If she hid the files somewhere before they got to her, we need to find them. She would have known this was coming." Abigail thought about a journalist who'd been investigating a defense contractor for an unspecified project, who had then gone on sudden medical leave, who had now been found unresponsive. She thought about what a careful person in that position would do with sensitive documents if they'd felt the walls coming in. She thought about what she herself would have done. She wouldn't keep them with her, Abigail said. And she wouldn't keep them at her office. She'd put them somewhere that couldn't be connected to her name. Where? Abigail's phone buzzed. Pharaoh's address, as promised. She looked at it and then looked up at Ethan and said, "We go to the annex first. We get somewhere secure. And then we think about where a journalist who knew she was being watched would leave something she needed to survive." They walked out of the coffee shop into the Fairmont afternoon, and Abigail did not look back, because she'd learned a long time ago that what mattered was not what was behind you, but whether you were moving faster than it. 3 blocks away, a black SUV with government plates that weren't government sat at a light. The passenger raised a phone and took a photo of the coffee shop entrance. They were 45 seconds gone, and the man in the passenger seat didn't know that yet. He would soon. By then, the question wouldn't be whether Abigail Carter was dangerous. The question would be how dangerous, and nobody who'd written her off as a temporary nurse was going to like the answer. The annex was a converted storage facility on the industrial side of Fairmont, the kind of building that looked permanently closed even when it wasn't. Faded signage, a chain-link perimeter, 2 cameras above the entry door that were newer than everything else by about a decade. Pharaoh's contact was already inside when they arrived. A woman named Solace, federal investigator, no agency specified, who opened the door before they knocked and looked at both of them with the particular expression of someone who had been waiting longer than they'd expected to wait and was recalibrating how bad things had gotten outside. "You're both on a watch list," she said by way of greeting. "Since when?" Ethan said. "Since about 40 minutes ago." Whoever flagged Cole's admission also pushed a secondary flag on Carter when the hospital reported the room breach. She stepped back and let them in. The interior was what the outside suggested: metal shelving, filing boxes, a folding table with a laptop and 2 phones, and a half-eaten sandwich that had been forgotten. "I have maybe 2 hours before this location gets compromised. People who shouldn't know about this annex have been accessing federal property records all morning." Abigail looked around the space and felt the particular compression of a situation narrowing. 2 hours. She'd operated in tighter windows, but usually with more than one exit and a clearer sense of what success looked like. Solis pulled up a file on the laptop. "Here's what I can confirm from our end. Hargrove Strategic Group has been under parallel investigation, DOJ, and a separate military oversight inquiry that's been running quietly for 14 months. We have financials, we have the ghost contract structures, we have 2 former employees who've given preliminary statements." She paused, and the pause was weighted. "What we don't have is anything that ties Laswell directly to Sandline. Everything we can prove points to the financial fraud. The ambush, the 4 operators who died, we can't put that on him yet without a primary witness who was inside the operational planning." She looked at Ethan. "I was never inside the planning," he said. "I saw the pre-mission documentation, I know what the patrol was carrying, and I know the authorization chain. But I can't tell you who gave the order to compromise the patrol's location because I don't know. I know who signed off on the contracts that made the whole operation financially worth doing." "That's enough to indict on conspiracy," Solis said. "Maybe, if we have the documents to support it." She looked between them. "Cole, you told Pharaoh you handed off documents to Margaret Osai 3 weeks ago. A full digital package. Contracts, authorization signatures, financial transfers, the pre-mission documentation I retained. Osai was hospitalized this morning. Suspected poisoning. Preliminary tox screen at Mercy General is showing something that looks like a high-dose benzodiazepine compound, But that's not confirmed yet. Solis's voice was flat, professional, the kind of flat that came from having to be flat. She's alive. She's not conscious. And her apartment was searched between the time she was found and the time the paramedics documented the scene. The search happened first, which means someone knew to go there before she was even in an ambulance. Abigail thought about the index in Ethan's pocket. 12 lines, handwritten, incomplete without the files. She hid them before they got to her, she said. She knew it was coming. How do you know that? Because she went on record as medical leave before she was actually ill. That's 2 weeks of cover. She was buying time to move something. Abigail looked at the laptop. Pull her published work. Everything in the last 6 months. She'd have left a reference, something that looks like journalism but points to a location. Solis looked at her for a moment. You're guessing. I'm pattern matching. She's an investigative journalist who knew she was being watched and knew her apartment would be the first place searched. She didn't keep the files there. She put them somewhere she could reference without it looking like a reference. Abigail pulled a chair to the table. Show me her articles. They worked fast. Solis pulled Osei's archive, 14 pieces over 6 months. Everything from a city council zoning dispute to a profile of a Fairmont veterans advocacy nonprofit. Abigail read the headlines and then the leads, looking for the thing that didn't fit, the piece that had no obvious reason to exist alongside the others. It was the nonprofit piece. Dated 9 days ago, the last thing Osei had published before the medical leave announcement. A short feature, 800 words, about an organization called the Meridian Veterans Resource Center, a small Fairmont nonprofit that provided records assistance to former service members navigating VA claims. The piece was warm and uncomplicated, the kind of local interest story that filled column inches without making anyone uncomfortable. It was completely unlike everything else in Osei's recent portfolio. This one, Abigail said. Ethan leaned over her shoulder and read it. She quotes the director. She quotes the director saying, Abigail found the line, "We keep everything, paper, digital, whatever a veteran brings us. It stays in our files until they need it. We don't throw anything away." She looked up. That's not a quote about a nonprofit. That's a message. The silence in the annex was brief and complete. She put the files there, Ethan said. She put them there and wrote the piece so she'd have a public record of having visited, so if anything happened to her, someone looking at her work would find the thread. Abigail was already standing. The director's name is in the article. The address is in the article. It's 40 minutes from here. Solis stood up at the same moment her phone went off. She looked at it, and something in her face shifted. Not panic, but the controlled version of alarm that federal agents developed instead of panic. "We have a problem," she said. "What kind?" "The kind where 2 vehicles just entered the industrial access road, and they're not city infrastructure." Abigail was at the window in 4 steps. 2 black SUVs, no plates visible from this angle, moving slowly enough to be looking for something specific. "Back exit," Solis said, and she was already moving to the shelving unit on the far wall, which swung out. Not theatrical, just practical. A fire egress that had been repurposed, revealing a narrow corridor and a door to the rear alley. They went through it. Ethan went last and pulled the shelf unit back into position behind them, a 3-second delay that mattered. The alley was concrete and shadow, and the smell of waste bins. Solis had a car parked at the far end, not government, a personal vehicle, old enough to not be trackable through any fleet system. They got in, and she drove without turning on the navigation, taking a route from memory, moving northeast through a residential neighborhood at exactly the speed limit. "We get to the resource center," Abigail said from the back seat. "We get the files. After that, we need a federal prosecutor who's not compromised." "I have one," Solis said. SDNY. She's been read into the Hargrove financial investigation for 2 months. If we hand her Cole's testimony and Osei's documents together, she has enough to move. Ethan said nothing. He was looking out the rear window, checking. "We're not being followed," he said after a moment. Then, "Yet." The Meridian Veterans Resource Center was a converted row house on a quiet street 3 blocks from a park, the kind of establishment that existed in the margins of civic attention, doing real work, mostly invisible, underfunded, occasionally thanked at city council meetings, and then forgotten by the next agenda item. A small, hand-painted sign by the door. hours listed as 9 to 5. It was 3:40 in the afternoon. The director was a man named Roy Upshaw, 60-something, a veteran himself. Abigail clocked the VFW pin on his collar before he'd finished opening the door, who looked at the three of them and then looked at Solis's credentials, and then looked at Abigail with an expression that suggested he'd been expecting someone for a few days and had not been certain who would show up. "Miss Ose called me," he said, "about 2 weeks ago. She asked if we could store something for a veteran she was helping." He paused. "She said if she didn't come back for it herself, the right person would." He led them to a back office, an overflowing space of filing cabinets and stacked boxes, and opened the bottom drawer of the cabinet nearest the window. Inside, in a sealed waterproof pouch, was a USB drive and a folded sheaf of papers, printed, signed, the kind of document trail that existed as physical backup precisely because digital could be wiped. Ethan picked up the drive. He didn't say anything for a moment. Abigail understood what he was holding. 4 operators, 18 months, 4 months of running, a journalist in a hospital bed, her own discharge, her own 2 years of quiet that hadn't been quiet at all, just the aftermath of something she hadn't known she'd been standing inside. Solis pulled out a secure device and connected the drive. "I need 10 minutes to confirm contents and encrypt the transfer." "You have 10 minutes, Abigail said. She went to the window while Solis worked, and Ethan stood with his arms at his sides and the kind of stillness that had nothing to do with calm. Outside, the street was ordinary. A woman walking a dog, a kid on a bicycle, the mundane texture of a city that didn't know what was sitting in a filing cabinet in a veterans nonprofit 3 blocks from its park. Solis said, "It's all here, contracts, signatures, financial transfers, and an audio file." She looked up. "There's an audio file. 16 minutes. What is it?" Solis pressed play. The voice that came out of the small speaker was male, unhurried, the voice of someone accustomed to rooms that agreed with him. And the words were specific, operational, unambiguous, authorization, coordinates. The phrase "remove the problem at the source" used with the tone of someone requesting a catering adjustment. The voice belonged to Victor Laswell, and 14 seconds into the recording, he said his own name while referencing a contract document number. Ose hadn't just collected documents, she'd gotten him on tape. Solis was already calling her contact in New York. Ethan had sat down on the edge of a chair and was looking at his hands, the look of someone absorbing the fact that a thing they'd been running toward for months was now real and in the room with them, and reality after long pursuit always felt different than the pursuit itself. Abigail was still at the window. The woman with the dog had gone. The kid on the bicycle had gone. The street was empty in the way streets sometimes went empty in the 30 seconds before something happened. The SUV came around the corner slow, and this one had a second behind it, and a third. "Solis," Abigail said very quietly, and Solis looked up from her call and saw what Abigail was seeing and said something into the phone in a clipped, rapid voice, and then the front door of the Meridian Veterans Resource Center opened without a knock. Roy Upshaw was still in the front room. She could hear his voice, surprised, polite, the voice of a man answering a question he hadn't expected. And then a different voice, flat and without courtesy, asking where the people were who had just come in. Ethan was on his feet. Solis had the drive in her hand. Abigail looked at the window, ground floor, alley access, and then at the door, and then at the filing cabinet between them and the door, and made a calculation that she'd learned to make in a lot of worse rooms than this one. "How many?" Ethan said, barely a sound. She held up 3 fingers, then pointed at the window. He moved to it without further instruction. She moved to the filing cabinet, and from the front room, Roy Upshaw said in a voice that was trying very hard to stay steady, "I don't know who you're talking about. Nobody came in except—" A sharp sound, not a gunshot. Something harder, shorter. The sound of a man being pushed into furniture. Abigail looked at the door handle, which was beginning to turn. The door handle completed its turn, and Abigail drove her shoulder into the filing cabinet. It wasn't elegant. The cabinet weighed somewhere around 200 pounds fully loaded, and it moved 6 inches before momentum ran out, but 6 inches was enough to catch the door mid-swing, and the man on the other side hit resistance he hadn't expected. She heard him grunt. She was already moving to the window where Ethan had the latch open and was pushing the frame up with his good arm, the other hand braced, ribs visibly costing him. Solis went through first. She was the smallest, and she moved fast, dropping to the alley with a controlled roll that was professional and slightly ugly, the kind of landing that worked rather than looked good. Ethan went next, slower, and the sound he made when he hit the ground was brief and involuntary. Abigail went last. She cleared the window and dropped as the filing cabinet lost its position and the door swung open behind her. She didn't look back. The alley was narrow, running between the resource center's back wall and a chain-link fence with a parking lot beyond. And Solis was already at the fence, finding the gap where the bottom had been pulled up by years of people using it as a shortcut. And they went through it in sequence while behind them, voices in the alley were organizing, calling to each other. Not panicked, trained. Solis's car was 2 blocks north. They made it in 90 seconds and got in, and she pulled out before any door was fully closed, not running the light at the end of the block but moving through it on the yellow, with the patient precision of someone who understood that a traffic stop was a worse outcome than being 30 seconds slower. "The drive," Abigail said. "Encrypted and transmitted," Solis said. "The moment I hit send before we ran, SDNY has it. My contact confirmed receipt." She took a right, then an immediate left, breaking the straight line. "The physical documents are still in my coat." Abigail looked back. No visual pursuit yet. The side streets here were a grid, which was bad, predictable, but also meant multiple options. "They'll have the plates." "This isn't my car, it's my sister's." Nobody said anything for a moment. Ethan was in the back seat with his eyes closed, breathing in a deliberate way that Abigail recognized as pain management. Slow in, controlled out, a technique for keeping functional when the body was voting against it. She turned to look at him. "Tell me where," she said quietly. "Ribs. Left side." He opened his eyes. "Nothing new. I'm fine." She didn't push. Fine was relative, and he knew his own threshold better than she did. She faced forward. "We need somewhere to land while New York does whatever New York does." "I have a second location," Solis said. "Pharaoh set it up this morning when he saw the flags going up. Residential off any contract or lease I've signed. It's 20 minutes. "Then drive 20 minutes, Abigail said. The city moved around them. Ordinary Fairmont, rush hour beginning to thicken at the major intersections. The daily indifference of a place that had no idea what was traveling through it. Abigail watched the streets and thought about Roy Upshaw, still in the front room of the resource center when they'd gone out the window. She thought about whether he was safe. She thought about the answer to that question, which was that she didn't know and couldn't control it, and the most useful thing she could do for him, and for every other person downstream of this, was to make sure the drive Solis had transmitted was enough to move. "What does your SDNY contact need from Cole directly?" she asked. "A sworn statement. She'll want him on record about the pre-mission documentation, the authorization chain, everything he personally witnessed. She has the documents and the audio now. Cole is the corroborating witness. He makes the audio undeniable because he can testify to the context around every decision Laswell made." Solis glanced in the mirror. She can move on arrest warrants within 48 hours if the U.S. attorney signs off. She said she'd have a preliminary read within 2 hours of receiving the files, Ethan said from the back. "What about the people who came to the resource center?" "Private contractors. Hargrove has a security arm, so technically a subsidiary. Hargrove Protection Services. They operate legally in 17 states. What they did today is not legal, but they'll have a story for it." Solis's voice was flat. "That's why we need the federal machinery moving fast enough that the story doesn't have room to set." They arrived at the second location, a narrow house on a residential street, rented month to month under a name that belonged to one of Pharaoh's field assets, the kind of arrangement that existed in the infrastructure of federal investigative work without appearing in any file a contractor could access. Pharaoh was inside when they arrived, in person for the first time, and he looked roughly like Abigail remembered. Compact, gray at the temples, the face of a man who'd spent his career being underestimated at exactly the right moments. He took one look at Ethan and said, "You need a doctor." "I need 48 hours, Ethan said. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Farrow looked at Abigail. There's a retired trauma surgeon 2 streets over who consults for us. He's on his way. I don't need, Ethan started. Cole. Farrow's voice was not unkind, just direct. You have a fractured rib that's been untreated for at least 2 days. I can hear it when you breathe. You're not going to give a coherent sworn statement if you're managing that. Let the man look at it. Ethan closed his mouth. Abigail noted that as a minor victory for collective sense. They settled in. The house was sparse, federal safe house furniture, which meant the bare minimum arranged for function rather than comfort, and Solly set up her laptop at the kitchen table while Farrow briefed them on what had moved in the 6 hours since Abigail had first called him. It was more than she'd expected. The Hargrove investigation, which Farrow had been circling for 6 months in his unofficial capacity as a liaison between CID and a DOJ working group, had been escalating independently for the past week. A former Hargrove financial officer named Trent Baylor had approached a federal public defender 3 days ago with information about the ghost contract structure. Not the operational side, just the money, but the money was extensive and the trail was documented. Baylor had been motivated, Farrow explained, by the fact that he had a daughter with a medical condition that required expensive ongoing treatment, and he'd recently discovered that the insurance policy Hargrove had been providing him was fraudulent, which had a way of clarifying a person's loyalties with considerable efficiency. So the financial side was already cracking, Abigail said. Opening, not cracked. Farrow poured coffee that tasted like it had been made hours ago and didn't apologize for it. Baylor's information is solid on the fraud but stops before it gets to Sandline. He didn't know about the operational side. He thought he was working for a corrupt contractor, not an organization that had ordered the killing of 4 American soldiers. He set his cup down. What Cole has, and what's on that drive, closes that gap. The audio closes it completely. Laswell will lawyer up the moment he hears a federal marshal's name, Ethan said. He already has 4 lawyers on retainer who've been managing his various congressional inquiries for 2 years, Farrow said. That doesn't help him when the audio is him authorizing a coordinates compromise. That's not a civil matter. The surgeon arrived, a quiet man named Dr. Vance, who examined Ethan with the efficient brevity of someone who'd seen worse in worse places, confirmed 2 fractured ribs on the left side, taped them properly, and left without asking questions that weren't his to ask. Ethan sat straighter afterward, which was the only visible change, but the quality of his attention shifted. Sharper, less of his processing going into management. They spent the next 2 hours working through Ethan's formal statement with Solis recording and Farrow cross-referencing against the documents. It was slow, methodical work, the kind of reconstruction that required precision over speed, dates and document numbers and authorization signatures, and the specific sequence of decisions that had moved a classified military patrol into an ambush. Ethan spoke in the flat, specific language of someone who had rehearsed this account in his own head many times, in motel rooms and cars and borrowed spaces, and the flatness of it was not disengagement but the opposite, the careful control of a man keeping the emotion out of the account, so the account stayed accurate. Abigail sat to the side and listened and built her own internal map of the whole thing, the shape of it from Hargrove's founding through the ghost contracts, through the DOD relationships, through Sandline, through what had happened to her, through Osei, through the hospital room where someone had drawn a syringe and expected to find a sedated John Doe and had found her instead. Around 6 in the evening, Solis's phone rang. She stepped into the hallway and came back 2 minutes later with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. The U.S. attorney signed the warrants, she said, Laswell and 3 others. Federal marshals are executing as of now. The room went quiet for a moment. Farrow nodded once, slowly, like a man checking something off a list he'd been maintaining for a long time. Ethan said nothing. He looked at his hands again in the way he'd looked at them in the resource center, and Abigail understood that the weight of a thing arriving was not always lighter than the weight of carrying it. The others, she said. Who? Lyle Harmon, the Pinecrest physician, a Hargrove executive named Petra Wills, who managed the Protection Services subsidiary, and a DOD contracting officer named Gerald Marsh, who signed off on the original Sandline operational budget. Solis set her phone down. There are expected to be secondary warrants for the contractors who came to the resource center. and an investigation opening into the Pinecrest Hospital administration to determine who facilitated Harmon's access to Cole's chart. Abigail thought about Darlene Voss, who had sent her to 4 South and delivered a formal warning in a loud voice in a public corridor. She thought about Dr. Marcus Webb, who had told pharmacy to process Harmon's order without looking at it. She didn't know if either of them was culpable in the legal sense. They might be nothing more than people who'd been positioned to not ask questions, which was a different category of failing. She'd figure out what she thought about that later. Right now, it sat unresolved, which was where it belonged. "What about the 4 operators?" Ethan said. He meant the dead ones. He meant what happened to their records. Farrow looked at him directly. "The DOD is being briefed tonight. The official record of the Sandline operation will be reopened under the investigation. The conduct citations, there were posthumous findings issued against 2 of them in the original after-action report, which I understand was part of how the cover-up was structured. They made it look like the patrol made errors," Ethan said, and the flatness of his voice was a different kind of flatness now. "So the investigation closed on bad intel and operator failure. That will be reversed, formally, publicly, through the DOD review process." Farrow paused. "It won't be fast. These things aren't fast. But it will happen." Ethan looked at the table. He didn't say anything for a long moment. When he looked up, there was something in his face that was not relief. Relief was too clean a word for what it looked like, but a kind of settling, like ground that had been unstable for a long time finding something solid underneath. "Okay," he said. The next several hours were procedural in the way that follow-through on large things always was. Calls, documentation, the careful administration of what had broken open. Farrow coordinated with the DOJ working group. Solis transmitted Ethan's recorded statement to the SDNY prosecutor. Margaret Osei's condition was updated. She was conscious, still in Mercy General, responding to treatment. The compound in her system had been identified as a synthesized sedative, not a natural overdose, which formalized the attempt on her life as criminal and connected it to Hargrove's Protection Services arm through the same contractor who'd been identified at the resource center. Abigail called nobody. She had nobody to call in the conventional sense. No family in the immediate sense. No partner. No one whose voicemail would carry the right weight for a day like this. She sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and let the procedural noise of the other rooms move around her and thought about the specific shape of 2 years. The Roanoke Hospital, the temp agency, the 11 weeks at Pinecrest being talked over and talked around and assigned to different floors and warned formally in corridors. She thought about what it had taken to keep herself intact through the small daily erosions of being somewhere you were treated like you were temporary in every sense of the word. She thought about the moment she'd walked into room 412 that morning, which was today, she had to remind herself. This had all been one day. And the things she'd seen in Ethan Cole's eyes that she'd recognized before she'd understood why. Farrow came into the kitchen just after 9. He poured the old coffee down the drain and made new. "Laswell was arrested at his home in Fairmont at 7:43, he said. "There are cameras in his driveway. Someone will leak it by morning." He waited for the coffee to finish. "Harmon was arrested at a restaurant. He was having dinner." "Good," she said, and meant it plainly, without drama. Farrow set a cup in front of her. He sat down across the table. He was the kind of man who got to the point when the point was ready, so she waited. "Your discharge," he said. "The conduct review. CID was never given access to the original complaint you filed, the supply chain flag. It was suppressed at the command level before it could be referred." He folded his hands. "That suppression is now part of the Hargrove investigation because the command officer who buried it was Gerald Marsh, who was already operating in a consulting capacity for Hargrove at the time." She sat with that. Gerald Marsh, whose name she'd heard for the first time 6 hours ago, had been the person who'd taken her complaint out of the system and put it nowhere. He was currently being arrested. "The conduct review findings," Farrow continued. "They can be formally appealed and reversed through the Army's Board for Correction of Military Records. Given the investigation's findings, the appeal would be supported by the DOJ inquiry. It's not automatic, there's a process, but it's viable." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not telling you what to do with that. I'm telling you it exists." She thought about it. She thought about what she wanted, which was a genuinely harder question than it should have been because she'd spent 2 years not answering it. She'd built a life that was portable and minimized, easy to fold up and move, no sharp edges that caught on things when she had to go. The temp work, the bus to the hospital, the locker room, the patients who forgot her name. She'd told herself it was practical. She'd told herself she'd chosen it. "I'll think about it," she said. Pharaoh nodded. He was not the kind of man who pushed. She appreciated that specifically. Around 10:30, when the procedural work had reached a point where Solis was handling the remaining federal communications and Ethan was asleep in the back room, she could hear his breathing even from the hallway, the slightly labored rhythm of the taped ribs, functional but not comfortable. Pharaoh came back with something on his phone. "It's leaking," he said, and showed her the screen. A journalist had it. Not the Ledger, a national outlet, someone who'd picked up on the federal marshal activity around Laswell's property and started pulling threads. The headline was preliminary and cautious. "Defense contractor Hargrove Strategic Group executive arrested, sources say." The story had 3 paragraphs and a lot of hedging, but it had the name and it had the word murder conspiracy in the 3rd paragraph, attributed to a federal source who was anonymous and clearly very real. She read it twice. "By morning," Pharaoh said, "it won't be hedged." She handed his phone back. She thought about Victor Laswell being walked to a federal vehicle, the unhurried voice on Osei's recording saying, "Remove the problem at the source," and the 4 operators who had walked into an ambush that someone had arranged for profit, and the way the official record had been written to make their deaths look like their fault. "The men he killed," she said. "Their families will see this." "Yes. Tonight." "Probably." She nodded. She didn't have anything to say about that which was adequate to the fact of it, so she said nothing. Solis came into the kitchen at 11 with the particular expression of someone delivering information that was significant but required context. "We have a complication," she said. Pharaoh looked up. "Laswell's attorneys have already filed a motion in federal court alleging that the arrest is predicated on illegally obtained evidence, specifically the audio recording. They're arguing that Osei obtained it through unauthorized surveillance of a private conversation." "The audio is admissible," Pharaoh said immediately. "I know, and the prosecutor knows, and the judge will likely agree within 24 hours. Solis set her phone down. But Laswell's legal team has a separate argument running parallel. They're claiming that Cole's statement was obtained under duress from a federal agent who represented herself under false pretenses. She looked at Abigail. Specifically, they're claiming that you, not a federal agent, not licensed to operate in an investigative capacity, manipulated a hospital patient into fleeing a medical facility and into the custody of federal agents under the pretense of a medical emergency. The kitchen was quiet. Abigail looked at the table. She thought about room 412 and the drawn syringe and the man in the white coat she'd never seen before. She thought about the choice she'd made when she'd unclipped Ethan's restraints, which she'd made with full understanding of what it cost. "They're going to come after you directly," Solis said. "Your nursing license, the hospital room breach, possibly charges. It's a pressure move. They're trying to contaminate the witness chain by attacking the person who found the witness." "Will it work?" Abigail asked. Solis hesitated. "On the primary case? No. The evidence stands independent of you, but on you personally." She paused. "It could be complicated." Abigail thought about what complicated meant. She thought about the Resolute staffing contract, and the 11 weeks of being a background figure, and the formal warning delivered in a loud voice in a public corridor. She thought about 2 years of temp work, and the Army conduct review that had buried itself in her record like a splinter she'd learned not to touch. And she thought about something else, something she'd been carrying since this morning and hadn't examined directly. "The man in the white coat who came to Ethan's room," she said. "The one who dropped the tray and ran. He wasn't arrested." Pharaoh looked at her. "No, we don't have an ID on him." "I do," she said. Both of them looked at her. "I didn't know who he was at the time, but I've been running his face since this afternoon, and it came together an hour ago." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She'd been working this quietly in the background because she had a habit of not sharing half-formed things. "His name is Dale Pruitt. He's listed as a clinical consultant for a Fairmont medical staffing company called Meridian Health Partners, which is a different Meridian from the Veterans Center, just a coincidence of names. She turned her phone so Farrow could see the staff directory she'd pulled. Meridian Health Partners has a contract with Pinecrest Regional for supplemental specialist consulting, which is how someone who wasn't on any authorized staff list could walk onto the fourth floor carrying a medication tray without being stopped. Solis leaned forward. Meridian Health Partners. Incorporated 16 months ago, Abigail said. I couldn't get ownership records on a phone browser, but the timing, the access, the mechanism, someone built a structure to have medical access to Pinecrest on short notice. That's not improvised. Farrow was already on his own phone. His expression shifted through several stages quickly. Then he stopped and looked at Abigail with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Meridian Health Partners, he said slowly. The parent company. It's a holding entity registered in Delaware. He turned his phone so she could read the screen. The holding entity's registered agent is listed as Hargrove Strategic Group's legal division. The kitchen was very quiet again. Laswell hadn't just had a physician on a hospital staff roster who could be called to sign a medication order. He'd built an entire medical consulting shell specifically designed to give his people legitimate access to hospital systems. Lyle Harmon was the doctor who signed the chart, but Meridian Health Partners was the infrastructure that put the man with the syringe through the door, which meant there were more people in this structure than the 4 arrest warrants had named. How many hospitals does Meridian have consulting contracts with? Abigail said. Farrow looked at his screen. Currently active contracts in Virginia, 7 hospitals. She let that land. 7 hospitals. Medical access to patient records, medication systems, floor rosters, the ability to put someone in scrubs on a ward without a flag. They built it to be able to do this to anyone, she said. Not just Ethan. Anyone they needed access to in a medical setting. She looked at Farrow. That's not a detail on the Hargrove case. That's a separate criminal enterprise that's been operating in a healthcare system. Farrow was already composing a message. The prosecutor needs to know this tonight. She does, Solis agreed. Abigail sat back. She was tired in a way that went down to the layer beneath muscle, the kind of tired that 12-hour shifts occasionally produced, but that today had a different quality. Not the fatigue of routine, but the specific weight of having been at the center of something that had required her full self for the entirety of a day that had started with a bus ride and a bad cup of coffee and ended with the wall of a structure she hadn't known existed beginning to come down. The Laswell arrest would be on every major outlet by morning. The audio would become public within the week. The military records would open. The 4 operators who had died in an ambush that someone had arranged for the profit margins of a defense contract would have their names restored. And somewhere in the legal machinery that was now grinding forward, a motion filed by expensive attorneys was arguing that the person who had actually started the chain, who had walked into a hospital room alone, read a chart that everyone else had chosen not to read, and made a decision that nobody had asked her to make, was a liability to the case. She thought about that. She thought about Darlene Voss's voice in the corridor. You are a contracted temp. You follow floor protocols. She thought about Dr. Webb saying, I'll look at it when I get there without looking up. She thought about 11 weeks of being furniture. And then she thought about what Farrow had said about the Board for Correction of Military Records and the Army Conduct Review. And Gerald Marsh, who had buried her complaint and was tonight being arrested. And she thought about the question she'd been not answering for 2 years about what she actually wanted. The answer, when she let herself look at it directly, was not complicated. She wanted her record back. She wanted the 4 operators in Ethan's unit to have their names restored. She wanted Pinecrest Regional to answer for a physician who had signed a lethal medication order on a patient who had no idea he was in a hospital where someone could do that. She wanted Laswell in a federal courtroom where the audio played in front of a jury that had not been selected by his legal team. And she wanted to keep being a nurse because the work was real and the need for it never went away, and she was good at it in ways that nobody at Pinecrest had bothered to notice. None of that required her to do anything tonight except sleep, which she was not going to do. She was still going through the Meridian Health Partners contract records on her phone. Farrow had given her a login credential for a federal contractor database that he definitely wasn't supposed to share with civilians. When Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway at 12:30, he looked at her. He looked at the phone. He looked like someone who had slept 40 minutes and woken up with his mind already running. "There's more," she said. Not a question. He sat down. "The man I handed the documents to originally, before OSE, before I ended up running. He was DOD, a records officer named Phil Greer. He's been listed as deceased for 3 months. Accident. Like your other teammate. Like him." He folded his arms carefully around his ribs. "I don't think Greer is dead. I think he went underground the same way I did. And I think if Laswell's people are scrambling tonight, there's a version of events where they try to use Greer or the story of Greer to muddy the chain of custody on the original documents before the trial." Abigail looked at him. "You think he's reachable?" "I think someone should try before morning." He met her eyes. Pharaoh would know the channels. She stood. "I'll get him." She was at the kitchen doorway when her phone buzzed. The notification was from a news alert she'd set up 3 hours ago on Victor Laswell's name. She stopped and read it. It was not an update on the arrest. It was a statement released through Laswell's legal team at 12:38 in the morning, and the headline on the news aggregator read, "Laswell legal team announces voluntary cooperation. Claims evidence will exonerate." She read the statement. It was 4 paragraphs of careful language about a man who had given decades of service to American national security being targeted by a politically motivated federal overreach, and it ended with a line that made her read it twice. "Mr. Laswell has requested a direct meeting with the lead federal investigator assigned to the case and has indicated his willingness to provide information that will significantly alter the federal government's understanding of the events in question." She showed it to Ethan. He read it. "He wants to deal," Ethan said. "He wants to deal tonight," she said. "Before the documents and the audio go through the legal process, before anything is locked in." She looked at the statement again. "Significantly alter the federal government's understanding." She looked up. "He's going to offer something, someone, a name bigger than his own." Ethan was very still. "There's someone above him." "There's always someone above him," she said. "The question is whether the prosecutor takes the deal or lets it run. And the question after that," Ethan said quietly, "is what happens to everything Laswell knows if he's sitting in a room with a federal investigator and the door closes." She looked at him. "He's not offering cooperation," Ethan said. "He's buying time in a room where he gets to talk." His jaw tightened. "He's done this before. This is how he operates. He gets into a contained conversation and he finds the leverage. The question isn't what he's offering. The question is what he already knows about the people across the table." Abigail stood in the kitchen doorway at 12:40 in the morning, holding a phone with a statement from a man who had orchestrated the deaths of 4 soldiers and the attempted murder of a journalist and a patient, and done it all from behind a foundation that donated to veterans' causes. And she understood what Ethan was saying. Laswell wasn't surrendering. He was maneuvering. And somewhere in the chain between the federal prosecutor and the arrest and the morning news cycle, there was a room he was trying to get into. She went to find Pharaoh. Pharaoh picked up the phone on the second ring, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. She read him the statement. There was a silence on his end that had texture to it, the silence of someone running calculations fast. Then he said, "Where did this come from?" "His legal team released it publicly, 12:38. "That's not a cooperation offer," Pharaoh said, exactly as Ethan had said it. "That's a position move. He wants to be in a room before the audio gets authenticated and the documents are entered into the federal record. Once those are formally in, his leverage disappears." "So don't put him in a room," she said. "That's the prosecutor's call, not mine." A pause. "But I can make sure she has a specific conversation before anyone agrees to anything." She heard him move, a door opening. "Carter, the name he's going to offer, if there's someone above him in this structure, Ethan thinks there is." "Ethan's probably right." Another pause. "Stay where you are. Don't do anything. I mean that specifically." He ended the call. She went back to the kitchen and told Ethan what Pharaoh had said. Ethan received it with the stillness that was becoming familiar to her, the particular composure of someone who had learned to wait inside the worst possible situations without letting the waiting itself become another wound. "Do you trust him?" Ethan asked. She thought about it honestly. "I trust that his interests and ours are aligned right now," she said. "That's not the same thing, but it's enough." He nodded. "Okay." They sat in the kitchen together for the next 2 hours while the night moved around them. Solis had finally fallen asleep on the couch in the front room, the secure laptop closed on the coffee table. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator hum and the occasional sound of a car on the street outside. Abigail made more coffee. Ethan drank it without comment on the quality, which was fair because the quality was poor. Around 2:30, he said, "The four of them, Reyes, Kaminsky, Doe, and Tapper." He said the names carefully, the way you say names that have been carried for a long time in a specific interior space. Reyes had a daughter. She was 3 when he died. She'd be about 5 now. Abigail didn't say anything because he wasn't asking for a response. "I've thought about whether I should contact the families," he said. "I decided not to while I was running, because if I was found through them, it put them in range." He looked at his coffee cup. "I don't know if that was the right call. I know it was the practical one." "It was the right call," she said. "Practical and right aren't always different." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you say to a 5-year-old whose father is officially restored to honor posthumously? What does that mean to a kid who's never going to see him?" She thought about it. "It might not mean much to the 5-year-old right now," she said. "It'll mean something to the 15-year-old and the 25-year-old. The truth has a long reach." He looked at her. "Is that something they told you in the army?" "No," she said. "That's something I figured out after they tried to make me forget mine." He held her gaze for a moment. Then something in his face shifted. A fraction, a small releasing, and he looked back at his coffee. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Farrow called back at 3:47. He was brief and precise. The SDNY prosecutor had declined to offer Laswell a cooperative meeting. The documents and audio were proceeding through the formal authentication process. The 4 arrest warrants stood. A 5th warrant was being prepared overnight for Laswell's deputy, a man named Warren Keel, who had served as the operational coordinator between Hargrove's Protection Services and the DoD contracting side, the link between the money and the muscle. Farrow's contact at DOJ had confirmed that Keel had been building a separate exit strategy for 3 weeks, which explained why Laswell's attorneys had moved so quickly tonight. They already knew Keel was talking to someone, and the statement was an attempt to get ahead of it. "Laswell's maneuvering failed," Farrow said. "His legal team burned a significant chip for nothing." "And Keel?" she asked. "Already in federal custody as of 40 minutes ago. Voluntary surrender, his attorney present. He's talking." A pause. "There is a name above Laswell, a retired general officer with DoD advisory board positions, and a 20-year relationship with Hargrove that runs through 3 separate shell structures. I can't tell you the name yet. It'll be public within 24 hours. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the dark street. "Will it hold?" "If Keel keeps talking and the documents support it, yes." His voice was steady. "It'll hold." She went and woke Ethan. He processed it in silence. Then he said, "Keel was in the room for Sandline. He was the one who passed the coordinates." His jaw was tight. "I didn't know his name. I knew a description. Heavy set, late 40s, always wore civilian clothes in a military setting." "He's talking," she said. "Good," Ethan said. "The way you say a word when its meaning is too large to decorate." The morning came incrementally, the way mornings do after nights that don't involve sleeping. A gradual gray at the edges of the curtains. The sound of the neighborhood finding its rhythm, a garbage truck 2 streets over. Abigail sat at the kitchen table and watched the light change and thought about nothing specific for almost an hour, which was the closest thing to rest available. By 7, the story was everywhere. Solis was up, laptop open, cycling through feeds. The national outlets had caught up to the preliminary report from the night before and gone significantly further. The name Hargrove Strategic Group was in headlines. The word ambush was in headlines. 4 Special Forces operators was in headlines, with names to the names Ethan had said in the kitchen at 2:30, Reyes and Kaminsky and Doe and Tapper, printed in full in news articles for the first time since the official after-action report had described their deaths as the result of operational error. Abigail read those names on the screen and felt something that wasn't easily categorized. Not satisfaction. That wasn't quite it. Something older and slower. The relief of a thing being corrected that should not have needed correcting, mixed with the grief of how long it had taken. She showed Ethan. He read the article carefully, the way he read things, completely, without skimming. When he put the laptop down, he went very still for about 30 seconds, and then he stood and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, and neither she nor Solis said anything because there was nothing to say that was more important than the silence. He came back to the table. His eyes were red at the edges. He didn't comment on it, and neither did they. "What happens now?" he said. "Practical. Forward." "You give formal testimony to the federal prosecutor," Solis said. "We get you to New York within the week. That process is going to be extensive." She paused. "You'll need legal representation. I can connect you with an attorney who handles cases like this. Not a federal public defender. A private attorney with a security clearance who's worked DOD oversight cases." "I don't have money for a private attorney." "The attorney works pro bono on cases he considers significant," Solis said. "I think this qualifies." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "Okay," he said. Solis looked at Abigail. "The motion Laswell's team filed last night, targeting your involvement. Our legal team has reviewed it. The argument doesn't hold. You are a licensed registered nurse. You identified a patient safety concern. You acted within the boundaries of a healthcare professional responding to an emergency. The chart alteration and the unauthorized medication order are the legal violations, not your removal of a patient from a dangerous situation." "My nursing license," Abigail said. "The Virginia Board of Nursing will likely open a review. That's procedural. It happens automatically when there's an incident at a licensed facility. But the review will have access to the full federal investigation record, including the documentation of Harmon's fraudulent order." Solis held her gaze. "You're not going to lose your license." Abigail absorbed that. It sat differently than she expected. Not like relief, more like a delayed impact, the way a physical thing sometimes registered after the adrenaline cleared. "And Pinecrest?" she said. Solis was quiet for a moment. "The hospital administration is under federal review for facilitating Harmon's chart access. The investigation will determine individual liability. Several people will likely face professional board actions. The hospital itself..." She paused. "It's going to have a very public year." Abigail thought about Darlene Voss and the loud formal warning in the corridor. She thought about Dr. Marcus Webb and his expensive watch and his tablet and his voice saying, "I'll look at it when I get there," about a flag she'd placed on a patient's chart. She thought about whether either of them had known what they were adjacent to. Probably not, she decided. Probably they were just people who had been carefully positioned to not ask questions and had been very good at not asking them. That was its own kind of failing. But it was a different category from what Harmon had done, and she could hold the distinction without resolving it neatly. Because most things didn't resolve neatly, and that was not a reason to collapse the distinction. She would let the investigation find what it found. The following days were not cinematic. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, because there was a version of these events, the version that would eventually be in headlines, and she was already aware probably a longer form account somewhere, that would make the aftermath look like momentum and resolution and forward motion. The actual experience was closer to administrative exhaustion. Formal statements, legal consultations, a call from a Virginia Board of Nursing case officer that lasted 40 minutes and was conducted in the dry, careful language of institutional process. A conversation with a Resolute staffing representative who informed her, with genuine discomfort, that her contract with Pinecrest was terminated, which she had expected, and that Resolute was reviewing whether to continue her placement, which she had also expected. She did not argue with Resolute. She asked them to document the reason for the contract termination in writing, which they agreed to do, and she told them she'd be in touch, which she would, once she understood the full shape of what the federal investigation was going to make visible about the circumstances of her removal from Pinecrest. She stayed at the safe house for 3 days. On the second day, Margaret Osei was discharged from Mercy General, still weak, the compound in her system taking time to fully clear, but conscious and oriented and, as Solis related, furious in a productive and specific way. On the third day, The retired General Officer Farrow had mentioned a man named Douglas Wren, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, currently serving on 2 private defense advisory boards, was named in federal charging documents as a co-conspirator in the Hargrove investigation. His name broke across every major outlet within the hour. Abigail read the articles from the kitchen of the safe house and thought about the shape of a network, how it looked from outside like a series of disconnected events: a nurse's discharge, 4 soldiers' deaths, a journalist poisoning, a hospital patient with a lethal medication order, and how from inside it had always been one thing, one structure, held together by the assumption that the people in it were careful enough and powerful enough that nobody on the outside would assemble the pieces. They had not counted on a journalist who hid files in a veterans nonprofit. They had not counted on a former CID investigator who had been watching the financial edges of it for 6 months. And they had, most specifically, had not counted on a contracted temporary nurse who read a chart the way she did. Not because she was exceptional, but because she was trained, and because she had enough respect for patients to read the chart they actually had, rather than the story the floor had already decided to tell about them. That was the thing she kept coming back to, in the quiet of those 3 days. Not the takedown, not the warrants, not the names in federal charging documents. The chart. Room 412. The notation that said patient became agitated when staff attempted to remove personal effects, and the thing she'd noticed, which was that he'd had no personal effects. And the question that had followed say, so what was he agitated about? And the answer to that question, which was that he was agitated because 4 people had come into a small room and moved toward him without announcing themselves, which was a startled response from training, which meant he was trained, which meant he was not a psych case. That was what it had taken. Not heroism. Attention. She thought about all the charts she had read in 11 weeks that everyone else had summarized before she got to them, and how many of those summaries had already decided the shape of the patient before she'd walked into the room. On the 4th day, Farrow drove her back to her apartment. It was the first time she'd been there since the morning she'd taken the bus to Pinecrest for a 6:50 shift, which felt like something that had happened in a different frame of her life. The apartment was small and spare and exactly as she'd left it, which was both ordinary and strange. She stood in the middle of her living room for a few minutes. Then she made a list. The first item on the list was the Board for Correction of Military Records Appeal. Farrow had given her the contact information and told her the DOJ investigation's findings would constitute supporting documentation for the appeal. The process would take months, that was fine. She had learned to work in long time frames. The second item was Margaret Osei. She called Osei directly because Osei had left her a voicemail the day before, voice still slightly rough from the hospital stay, but the clarity of thought completely intact, saying she was working on the full account of the Hargrove investigation and she wanted to include Abigail's perspective, and she was asking rather than assuming, which Abigail appreciated. They talked for an hour. Osei was precise and fair and asked questions that showed she'd done the work before the call. At the end, she said, "Can I ask you something off the record?" "Sure," Abigail said. "Were you scared?" Abigail thought about it. She thought about the door to room 412 and the drawn syringe on the floor and the alley behind the Veterans Resource Center and the SUV coming around the corner. She thought about whether scared was the right word for what had been running through her system at any of those moments. "Scared is the wrong frame," she said. "When things are happening, you don't have the bandwidth for scared. You have the bandwidth for what's directly in front of you." She paused. "After. When it's over and you're in a kitchen somewhere at 3 in the morning and it's quiet. That's when it comes." "And then what?" Osei asked. "And then you do the next thing," Abigail said. "That's all there is." Osei published the account 5 weeks later. It ran in the Ledger and was picked up nationally within 18 hours. The headline was careful and specific. Abigail had asked her not to make it about a single person, but the piece made clear what had happened at Pinecrest Regional on a Tuesday morning when a contracted temporary nurse had read a chart and made a decision that everyone in the institution around her had failed to make. Abigail read the piece on a Thursday morning in a coffee shop, not the one where she and Ethan had sat, a different one, closer to her apartment. She read it once, felt something complicated move through her, and ordered a second coffee. The federal trial of Victor Laswell began 7 months after his arrest. By then, the charging documents included 23 counts covering conspiracy, murder for hire, fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice. Warren Keel had turned state's evidence, and his testimony was specific and devastating. Douglas Wren's defense team attempted 4 separate motions to separate his case, all denied. Lyle Harmon had pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges in a separate proceeding and was awaiting sentencing. Abigail was called as a witness. She testified for 3 hours over 2 sessions, the first about what she'd observed in Pinecrest Room 412, and the second about the medication order and the man who had arrived with the drawn syringe. She answered every question directly and without ornamentation, and when Laswell's defense attorney attempted to characterize her actions as reckless and unauthorized, she said, "I identified a patient safety emergency. I responded to a patient safety emergency. That's what nurses do." The attorney moved on. Laswell was convicted on 19 of 23 counts 8 months after the trial began. Wren on all counts in a separate verdict 10 days later. Keel received a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation, a fact that Abigail had complicated feelings about and was honest with herself about having complicated feelings about, because the justice system's mechanics were not always satisfying even when they were working. The reduced sentence was the cost of the cooperation that made the full case possible. She could hold that as an imperfect fact rather than a defeating one. Harmon received 7 years. The Meridian Health Partners investigation uncovered irregular access arrangements at 4 of the 7 hospitals under contract, 2 of which required full audits of patient records going back 3 years. The implications of that, the question of how many other patients had been in the position Ethan Cole had been in without anyone noticing, was a longer and harder investigation that Solis was still coordinating when the Laswell verdict came in. Abigail's Board for Correction of Military Records appeal was approved 11 months after she filed it. The conduct review findings were vacated. Her service record was restored. The official language was formal and procedural, the kind of restoration that existed entirely in documents and had no ceremony attached to it, which was fine. She wasn't interested in ceremony. She was interested in the record being accurate. She received the letter on a Wednesday afternoon and read it twice, standing in her kitchen. She felt something move through her that she didn't immediately have a name for. Not triumph, not vindication in the dramatic sense, something quieter. The particular feeling of a thing being made true that had always been true, finally entering the official record of reality. She put the letter on the table and stood at the kitchen window and let the feeling settle. Then she went back to work. She had reapplied for nursing licensure in good standing 3 months earlier, after the Virginia Board of Nursing Review concluded that no professional violations had occurred, and that the Pinecrest incident was not an action by Abigail Carter requiring discipline, but rather an incident at Pinecrest Regional Hospital requiring investigation. The investigation was ongoing. Several members of the hospital administration had resigned. Darlene Voss had retired quietly. Dr. Marcus Webb had received a formal censure from the Virginia Board of Medicine for processing a medication order without adequate clinical review. Abigail had accepted a position at Greystone Medical Center 20 minutes from her apartment in the emergency department. Not a temp contract, a staff position, permanent, with a clinical educator component that had been written into the role specifically because the department director, a brisk, direct woman named Dr. Imani Torres, who had read the OSE piece and then called the Resolute staffing agency to find out who Abigail was and how to reach her, had decided that whatever it was Abigail did when she read a patient, the ER needed more of it, and it needed to be teachable. The conversation in which Torres had offered her the job had taken 12 minutes. "I read your record," Torres said. "Army 68W, 2 deployments, nursing license, 2 years at Roanoke Regional, 11 weeks at Pinecrest." A pause. "I also read what happened at Pinecrest." "Most people have at this point," Abigail said. "I'm not interested in the headline. I'm interested in the chart notation you flagged before any of the rest of it happened." Torres was looking at something on her desk, presumably a document. "You identified an inadequate clinical assessment from an overnight handoff note and flagged it before morning rounds. That's not dramatic, that's just good nursing." "Yes," Abigail said. "I need people who do that, not people who waited to see if anyone else was going to do it. People who just do it." Torres looked up. The educator component means you are also responsible for working with residents and junior nurses on patient assessment, specifically on the gap between what a chart says and what a patient presents. I think you have something to teach about that gap. Abigail had thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. Yes, she said. Good, Torres said. Start date? The emergency department at Greystone was not a gentle environment. It was loud and chronically understaffed in the way every ER was chronically understaffed, and the cases were difficult and the shifts were long, and there were nights when things went wrong despite everything, and days when the pace was such that she barely had time to register the transition from one patient to the next. She was not always good at the teaching component in the way she wished she were. She was better at demonstrating than explaining, and she sometimes skipped steps in assessments that were instinct for her, but not yet instinct for a second-year resident, and Torres called her on it when it happened. Walk them through it, Torres said one evening, after a case debrief in which Abigail had caught a developing tension pneumothorax 20 minutes ahead of the imaging and had communicated her finding to the resident working the case in a way that was accurate but too compressed to be educational. They can't see what you're seeing yet. Show them the path. I know, Abigail said. I'll do better. You're not being criticized. You're being coached, Torres said. There's a difference. She registered the distinction and took it seriously. She got better at the walking through. She was never entirely natural at it. She was constitutionally more comfortable doing than explaining. But she got functional at it, and there were moments in case debriefs where she could see a resident catch the pattern she was describing and incorporate it, and those moments had a particular quality she had not anticipated and found that she valued. Ethan Cole came to Fairmont once, 8 months after the arrest. He was living in Colorado, the detail of which he'd told her in a phone call 3 weeks after the safe house, when he'd finally had something like a fixed address. He'd been working with a veterans advocacy organization in Denver, the legal and records side, helping former service members navigate the VA system, which required the particular combination of patience and bureaucratic tenacity that he apparently had in quantity. They had coffee at a place near her apartment, not the chain coffee shop, an independent place that had been there since before either of them had lived in Fairmont. He looked better than he had. The bruising long gone, the ribs healed, a quality in his face that wasn't ease exactly, but the absence of the particular alert exhaustion of a man who'd been running. He still checked the door when someone came in. She suspected he always would. They talked for 2 hours. About the trial, about his testimony, about what it had been like to sit in a federal courtroom and watch the formal machinery of accountability move against people who had believed they were beyond it. About the 4 operators and the official DOD ceremony that had restored their records and honored their service. Ethan had attended in Colorado because the families lived there, and he had stood in the back and let the families have the front and said he'd felt both glad and inadequate, which was honest, and she appreciated that he'd said it honestly rather than tidying it. He asked about the appeal. She told him it had been approved. How does that feel? He asked. She thought about how to answer that. Like something being put back in the right drawer, she said. Which sounds small. It isn't small, it's just, it doesn't undo the 2 years. It just means the record now matches the reality. She held her coffee cup. I've decided that's enough. Is it? It's what exists, she said. So, yeah, it's enough. He nodded. He understood that the way he understood most things, directly, without requiring it to be more elegant than it was. Before he left, standing at the entrance of the coffee place with the afternoon light coming in from the street, he said, You didn't have to walk into that room. I know. I want to make sure you know I know that. She looked at him. Go home, Ethan. He almost smiled. Yeah. Okay. He left. She finished her coffee and sat in the quiet for a few minutes, thinking about what he'd said and what she would have said if she'd been in the mood to explain it, which she wasn't, but she turned it over anyway. She had walked into the room because the chart had a gap in it, and she was the person standing there who knew how to read the gap. That was the whole of it. She had not made a heroic decision. She had made the only decision that was consistent with what she knew and what she was, and the reason it had looked like courage from the outside was that the people around her had made a different decision. The decision to accept the chart as written, the story as given, the patient as the floor had already decided he was. And that decision was so common and so normalized that departing from it looked exceptional. It wasn't exceptional. It was just the job, done correctly. That was what she tried to teach the residents. Not the big moments, not the dramatic catches. The small discipline of approaching each patient as if the chart were a starting point rather than a conclusion. The habit of asking the next question after the obvious question. The practice of staying in the room long enough to see what the room had to show you, rather than confirming what you'd already decided before you walked in. Most of them got it. Some of them struggled with it. A few of them were naturally gifted at it in a way that required her only to point and let them go. One resident in particular, a second-year named Dr. Priya Anand, sharp and occasionally overconfident in the way that the sharpest residents sometimes were, came to her after a debrief one night and said, "How do you know when you're right?" Abigail thought about room 412, about a chart that said one thing and a man whose eyes said something else entirely, about the specific weight of a decision made in a hallway outside a closed door. "You don't always know," she said. "You know that the evidence in front of you doesn't match the story being told about the evidence. You know what questions haven't been asked. You go in and you ask them." She looked at Anand. "And then you stay in the room for the answer." Anand absorbed that. What if you're wrong? Then you're wrong, and you figure out why, and you do it better next time. Abigail held her gaze. Being wrong is recoverable. Not asking is harder to fix. She thought about those words later, alone. She thought about whether she believed them fully, or whether there were ways in which she didn't, ways in which the 2 years of temp work and the discharge and the suppressed complaint and the general project of making herself small enough to fit into spaces that didn't want her had left costs she hadn't fully tallied. She thought honestly about it and decided that yes, there were those costs, and she was still carrying some of them, and probably always would be, and that was not a defeat but a fact, and facts could be worked with. She was not the same person she'd been the morning she walked into Pinecrest for the last time. She was also not entirely different. The core of it, the thing that had walked her through the door of room 412 without being asked, was what it had always been. It had just had 2 years of being told it wasn't there. It had always been there. On an evening in late autumn, a year and 4 months after the Laswell verdict, she was finishing a 12-hour shift in the Greystone ER when a call came in from the triage desk. Trauma incoming, MVA, multiple patients, ETA, 6 minutes. She shifted into the rhythm of it. Task distributed, bay prepped, team-oriented, the fast and functional choreography of people who had done this together enough times to move without running through the steps. Afterward, when the bay had cleared and the patients were stable and the team was doing the administrative tail of the shift, a young resident, not Anand, a newer one, barely 4 months in, a kid named Marco who was still at the stage where he wrote everything down twice, came to find her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." "Tonight, with the secondary patient, you called the internal bleed before the imaging. I saw you do it. How did you know?" She thought about how to answer. She thought about what Torres had said. Walk them through it. Show them the path. His presentation didn't match his vitals, she said. His pressure was stable, which is what everyone else was tracking. But his skin was wrongs, not the color, the texture. And his affect was flat in a way that wasn't pain flat. It was shock flat. And his abdomen, on palpation, she paused, making sure he was following, gave me a tone that said there was more going on than the stable pressure suggested. Marco was writing. "You can't learn that from a list," she said. "You have to see it enough times that the pattern gets into your hands. That takes time." She looked at him. "But what you can learn right now is this. When the picture doesn't fit the frame, don't fix the picture. Change the frame." He looked up from his notes. "What does that mean?" "It means trust what you're observing over what you've been told," she said. "The chart is a conversation someone else had with the patient before you got there. You're having a new conversation. Pay attention to what it's telling you." He wrote that down too. She watched him go and stood for a moment in the hallway of the Greystone ER. The particular late shift quiet of an emergency department between surges, monitors beeping in an irregular rhythm, the smell of antiseptic and coffee, and the low-level exhaustion of people doing difficult work with genuine care, and she thought about where she was standing compared to where she had been. She thought about the 11 weeks of being furniture, the formal warning in the corridor, the bus to work, the bad coffee, the charge nurse who had called her the temp twice and been corrected twice and had not retained the correction. She thought about a John Doe with soldier's eyes in a room with a yellow flag on the door, and the decision to walk in alone, and the syringe on the floor, and the alley behind the resource center, and the kitchen of a safe house at 2:30 in the morning, and the formal language of a military record restored to accuracy. She thought about Ethan Cole in Colorado, doing the quiet work of helping veterans navigate systems that had failed them. She thought about Margaret Osei, back at the Ledger, on a new investigation she hadn't disclosed the subject of, which was exactly right. She thought about Reyes and Kaminsky and Doe and Tapper, whose names were now in the official record in the accurate way. She thought about a 5-year-old who was now almost 7, who would one day be 15, who would one day read what the record said about her father. She tied off her documentation, grabbed her jacket from her locker, and walked out through the ER entrance into the cold autumn evening. The parking lot was lit with the particular orange-white of hospital lighting, the kind that turned the night flat. Her car, not a bus, she'd bought a used car 4 months ago, a small practical thing that started reliably, was at the far end. She walked to it without hurrying. She had learned in the Army that panic saved nobody. She had learned in the 2 years after the Army that silence could be mistaken for absence if you let it be, and that the cost of letting it be was paid in ways that were hard to audit until the bill arrived all at once. She had learned in a hospital room in Fairmont, Virginia, that attention was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing. The difference between a chart that told a story and a patient who was living a different one. The difference between a nurse who was temporary and a person who was not. She got in the car. She sat for a moment in the quiet. Then she drove home.